So I'm going to guide my own question, raise hands. What? Oh, right. Do it through the mics, though.
One over this side and one over this side. So if you have a question.
I put you all to sleep. Okay, there we go. Got one courageous soul.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Hello?
Is it turned on?
Not that good of mine.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello?
It's not working.
It's not working.
I'll repeat the question if you can't hear it.
The first thing I said was that I thought that was terrific.
He thought I'm great. Oh, I got one.
I'm curious about...
Yeah, talk to them. Oh, good. Yay.
Hello. I'm curious about something that isn't on point
Sure.
Of what you were discussing, but that you referenced several times.
Okay.
As the father of a 17-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl.
Yep.
Thank you. You talked about the difference between boys and girls.
Yes.
You alluded to the difference between boys and girls.
Yep.
Those of us who have met each gender understand that there are differences.
They're different.
What do you see in the, are there things that you see in brain development that help explain some of the things you discussed and that we see in the differences in girls and boys in this adolescent period? And do you see differences, and do similar differences appear in the institutionalized children as in the general population?
That's the $64 million question. Yes, there's lots of developmental differences in the brains of men and women, boys and girls, but they're relatively small. There's more overlap than there's difference. It's what we know. Regions in the corpus callosum that are different probably have to do with women sharing information between hemispheres a little differently than men do. If we could slice and dice the hypothalamus, we know that one works differently because, hey, women, we cycle, they don't. News. That's hypothalamic. There are all those differences. There's evidence that there are differences in the organization and structure of the amygdala. That's a lot of that's animal data, though. We don't really know. There's so much we know in animals and relatively little that we know. I'm looking at Melinda over there to make sure I'm right in saying this, in human development. And part of that's because the imaging studies, the imaging techniques are relatively new. Teenagers are, Amanda, that was you over there. Wow, that's one of my students. This is a treat. I didn't get to know I was going to see you. Wow. So at any rate, we're just beginning to do these studies. We're imaging, we're scanning, and it takes a lot of time. So if somebody is like a gold mine of gender differences in the brains of teens, raise your hands, and I will gladly refer to you. So much of what we've been looking at, though, yet, has been cognitive development. They're cold cognitive tasks that have been done in the scanner, and boys and girls don't differ as much in that as you might believe. Boys are a little behind girls, because yes, ladies, we're better than they are. But in general, we're much more similar on those. The real question is, how do we handle hot cognitive things, things that have emotion, and how do we respond potentially differently to peers? And to my knowledge, a lot of that hasn't been brought into tasks you can put into the scanner very easily. And that said about typical development, by the way, if you ask any question, we know more about adults. If we ask about development, we generally don't know very much, because neuroscientists don't like to touch development, it's too complicated. And if we want to ask about PI kids, then we know even less. So I don't know the answers on the sex differences. I do know that looking at kids prior to puberty, if anything, what I see, and you saw it in my data, is that sex differences that might have been there are not as distinct prior to puberty in kids who come out of deprivation in the tasks that I've looked at. But I haven't written the paper on that yet. I'm not sure I believe it as a generality. Yeah, over here.
Have you looked at learning disabilities and the difference from kids that have been institutionalized from the children that haven't been, and the impact that has in 20 years?
Sure. The question is, have I looked at learning disabilities? Many of these kids have IEPs, of course, and they have specific learning disabilities. Have I looked at those? Have I looked at those relative to kids who haven't been in deprivation early in life, and have I looked at them in the context of the teenage years? The answer for 99% of that is nobody has. What we have been doing is, so many of the children who come out of institutions or early deprivation struggle with attention and attention regulatory problems and get labeled as having ADHD. The question is that a different kind of ADHD? Is the pathways may be different for that than we would see in children who are raised under benign and low-risk conditions who maybe have a family loading for ADHD and show it. I have a student who's trying to work on that question. She's in the middle of her dissertation, and Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll have a bit of an answer on that. There's a little bit out of the Mike Rutter's group attempting to look at that with some evidence that there might be a bit of a difference, but we really, I don't think, and I don't think BEIP is doing any of this, are they, Jen? No, not on ADHD. Right, we've all found problems with attention tasks, but less with the impulsivity, and I think you saw that in my data. That's very consistent with the risk-taking not being hyper, so it seems to be more with those attention circuits than with the impulsivity. Though they have trouble with hyperactivity, they can't regulate their motor movements as well. Yeah.
I was wondering.
Hello to you.
Hi.
Boy, it's like old times. Good to see folks.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the idea that has been put forth, I think, by Jay Belsky and others about plasticity kind of cutting both ways.
Sure.
And that the individuals that are actually the most vulnerable to these negative experiences may actually also be benefit the most from good experiences.
Sure. So, a really interesting concept and rather controversial concept, which makes it a Jay Belsky concept, because he likes to put things out that will get people arguing with him. So, but it seems to be holding a lot of water. So what Belsky and actually Tom Boyce in a different way have been arguing is that, and Belsky's is specifically in the context of the genes you're born with, okay? That we seem to have a number of genetic variations that are very common in the population. Like many of us carry the at least one short allele of the serotonin transporter that might put us at risk for being depressed, right? Dopamine genes, there are variations in them. They're pretty common in the population. So you got to ask what nature was up to. Because if things are really bad, if they only reduce your fitness, your ability to have offspring that carry your genes on, they're going to go bye-bye. We won't see them around except rarely. So if things are really common, you got to assume that under some conditions they actually enhance your fitness, your survival ability. What Belsky's been talking about is that some of these genes might be better thought of as plasticity genes. Genes that make us more sensitive to the variation in context, which would argue that under some situations it would enhance our functioning, and under others it would maybe impair our functioning. We have seen this actually in some of the work I've been doing, looking at a gene called the BDNF, the gene that regulates the production and trafficking of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a substance in the brain that helps repair nerve growth and repair. Rather an interesting thing to look at if you're looking at kids recovering from conditions of deprivation. There is a genetic allele in this, a single nucleotide, just one little switch. Instead of a valine, you produce a methane, and one little spot on that gene is a little tiny switch, but it influences the efficiency of that gene in being able to keep BDNF in circulation to be able to play a role in brain plasticity. And it's been associated with potentially risk for depression and learning problems and so forth and so on. So we've looked at that in kids adopted from institutions as part of all that neuroimaging stuff that I showed you with the prefrontal cortex and all that good stuff. Parents have been reporting to us on how many problems the kid has with attention and attention regulation. What we find, if the kids get to the families early, if they carry the version of the gene that's supposed to be the bad version, They have fewer problems with attention than kids who don't carry the bad version of the gene. Obviously, it's not a bad version of the gene. If they get there later, they have more problems. So it seems to make you more sensitive. We think that what it's doing is slowing down development so that when the kids get to their families, they still have more opportunity to shape the brain in the context of the families. But after a certain point, those neural systems are set, and they have more trouble responding to the plasticity. So that's one example. We see a lot of this in all these kind of common genes that may be helpful, plasticity genes. Yes?
You talked about children at risk for social issues and not being so aware of what other people are feeling. Have you seen the reverse of that at all, and where kids are kind of more keyed into kind of like survival instincts of being very cued into what's happening with other people and their relationships around them, and less able to identify what they themselves are feeling?
That's a very interesting question. Did you all hear it? Have we seen kids who seem to be hypersensitive to what's going on around them in terms of other people and less able to sort of read their own feelings and sort of just mirroring what they're seeing around them? I haven't looked for this. I haven't seen it. I might imagine, though, if you're hyper-fearful, you do become highly aware of everything that's going on around you. And it may not be that you're reading it well, but you're aware of it. But I haven't seen the other. It'd be interesting. If you've got cases, it would be interesting.
I got a daughter.
Got it, okay. Might be very interesting to look at. If you live around here, talk to Jen. One more. Yeah.
Sorry, just to make sure I got the words right. So at the very end of your talk, you mentioned the pubertal stress recalibration hypothesis.
Yeah,
I think one of the things that I've been really interested in recently is sort of, I think you mentioned this in another talk that I saw on YouTube like a month ago, was the sort of allostatic load and adaptive calibration models. So you have like
Yes.
the Bruce Ellis stuff and the McEwen stuff.
Yep.
Is this pubertal stress recalibration hypothesis, sorry, so sort of jargony,
Blah, 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 blah.
is that the best way to sort of to bring those two theories together in terms of thinking about how are we going to navigate the teen years? That's sort of a huge question, but.
Good question. Is it the best way to bring them together? I hadn't thought of trying to steal both theories and shove them into mine. Maybe I will. I see it as really more of a subcomponent of the adaptive calibration model. They argue that we're constantly, which we may be, but I think it's a little overmuch. I think the pubertal period is a recalibration period.
And in terms of policy making, do you think one of those right now has a bit more weight, or it's 50-50, or too early to say?
So what he's talking about is the allostatic load model of Bruce McEwen, which was really developed to talk about adults, and it seems to work very well for teens. He has to graft information about early experience sort of onto that model. Your early experience sets you up for being more vulnerable when things are challenging, to hyperactivate your stress systems and maybe accumulate more of that load more rapidly. So that's how all that deals. The evidence is pretty strong that some of what Bruce is talking about is going to be accurate. The reopening at puberty is a much newer thing. Would I go to policymakers with one or the other? I certainly would probably say Bruce is now more than the other. I think we're just learning. On the other hand, you also have to ask the do no harm question. If what we're arguing is that it's really, really important to get to kids before puberty to help them with the skill set they're going to need to navigate the teen world and to figure out very pointed ways of being able to get there and retrain the brain, it's not like you might do much harm with that, right? I mean, even if they didn't need it, we can all get more socially skilled and competent. So I think it's worth a message. We know they've got skill deficits when we hit them to try to improve that. It seems that before adolescence would be a good deal, with or without my pubertal stress hypothesis being correct or not.
Okay.
Thank you, Hal.
Thank you.